The American South has always been a haunted place. Long before tourists flocked to photograph crumbling columns or stroll beneath trees draped in Spanish moss, the land itself carried secrets it refused to surrender. Whispers clung to the ruins of plantations, to the hollowed mansions with their shutters hanging loose, to the fields where no cotton has grown for more than a century. Among the many horrors birthed by slavery, there are stories so grotesque they rarely appeared in books or polite conversation. These were not the tales of overseers' whips or the cruel arithmetic of the auction block. Those were horrors society eventually admitted. This story, however, belongs to the ladies, the wives, the daughters, the white mistresses of the house who wore silk gowns and lace gloves, who smiled from the safety of wide porches while their husbands conducted business in the fields. They entertained guests with music and laughter, presiding over parlors filled with the fragrance of magnolia and tobacco smoke. To outsiders they appeared refined, genteel, the very picture of southern womanhood. But at night, when the candles burned low and the doors were bolted, a select few of these women revealed themselves as something else entirely. It is said they tortured the enslaved black men under their household, not for punishment, not for vengeance, but for entertainment. Their cruelty was not hidden behind necessity or the brutal economy of slavery. It was spectacle, a game, a perverse indulgence. The stories that survived are fragmentary, half-whispered testimonies buried in diaries, in court papers, in oral history passed down in fear. To read them is to step into a nightmare one prays is exaggerated, but sometimes the truth does not need embellishment. Sometimes the horror is exactly what it appears to be. The tale begins on a plantation in Louisiana, deep in the bayou country where rivers ran like black veins through the swamp and cicadas wailed like lost souls at dusk. The estate was known as Belle, beautiful oak, named for the massive tree that shaded the front lawn. At its peak, the plantation was a kingdom unto itself, with hundreds of acres of sugarcane fields and over 200 enslaved people laboring under the sun. Its master, Colonel James St. Clair, was a wealthy planter who prided himself on discipline and order. But it was not the colonel who left behind the darkest legacy of Belle. That legacy belonged to his wife, Eleanor, and her two sisters, Charlotte and Margaret, who came to live with her after the war took their husbands. Eleanor St. Clair was a woman of striking beauty, even as she aged. She was tall with sharp cheekbones and eyes so pale they seemed almost colorless. Neighbors described her as a woman of impeccable manners, one who could charm a guest with a single glance. Yet the enslaved people of Belle told a different story in hushed tones when no overseer was near. They said Mistress Eleanor had a temper colder than ice, and that her smile, though dazzling, was only a mask. Her sisters were no better. Charlotte was plump and rosy, with a girlish laugh that seemed out of place in a woman nearing 40. Margaret was quieter, her voice soft, almost kind, but her silence concealed a darker appetite. The three sisters were inseparable, and together they were feared more than any overseer on the estate. For while most mistresses confined their cruelty to harsh words, to slaps, or to the occasional order to have someone whipped, Eleanor and her sisters were said to treat torture as a form of diversion. They invented games, competitions, and spectacles with human suffering at their center. They were women with too much leisure, too much power, and no restraint. At first, the stories tell of small cruelties, tricks played on the household servants, forcing them to perform humiliating tasks, laughing at their discomfort. But these amusements quickly escalated. One account, preserved in the testimony of a runaway who later reached the north, described how Eleanor once ordered a young man to kneel on a pile of broken glass while reciting lines from the Bible. When his voice faltered from pain, she struck him with the poker from the fireplace until he continued. Another story claimed that Charlotte devised a game in which she blindfolded the men and forced them to walk barefoot through the courtyard while she and her sisters threw sharp stones at their feet, clapping and laughing like children at a fair. What made their cruelty so disturbing was not only its sadism, but the way it was dressed in the trappings of leisure. To them, pain was not a tool of labor control, but a form of theater. They staged their spectacles in the parlor or the cellar, rooms meant for wine and music, not for screams. Guests were sometimes invited to watch, though most pretended not to know when such things occurred. Rumors spread, but who would accuse the wives of one of Louisiana's most powerful planters? One of the most chilling accounts described a night during which Eleanor and her sisters held what they called a masquerade. They dressed in gowns of crimson and gold, their faces covered by Venetian masks, and they forced 3 enslaved men to fight one another in the candlelit parlor. The men were unarmed, their hands bound at first, while the sisters goaded them on with jeers and laughter. When the men refused to harm each other, Eleanor allegedly produced a riding crop and lashed them until desperation drove them into violence. The sisters clapped and cheered as though they were watching a play. By the time the masquerade ended, one man lay unconscious, blood pooling at his temple, while the women drank champagne and toasted to their little carnival. Whether every detail of these stories is fact or rumor hardly matters. Enough fragments exist, from enough separate voices, to suggest a pattern too grotesque to dismiss. Enslaved people who lived under the St. Clair women remembered them as demons in silks, their laughter forever echoing through the halls of Belle. Chêne. Neighbors recalled strange sounds from the house at night, screams that carried across the bayou, muffled quickly, followed by bursts of female laughter. Even other planters, men hardly known for mercy, are said to have avoided Belle Chêne's invitations after whispers of the sisters' entertainments grew too persistent. The climax of their cruelty came one summer night in 1851, during what was later called the Harvest Feast. The plantation had enjoyed a profitable season, and Colonel St. Clair hosted a gathering of neighbors and merchants to celebrate. The house glowed with lantern light, and music filled the air as couples danced in the ballroom. But in the cellar below, Eleanor and her sisters staged a performance of their own. The cellar beneath Belle Chêne was cool and damp, lined with brick walls that held the smell of earth and mildew. By day, it stored casks of wine and sacks of flour. By night, when the ladies descended with lanterns and whispers, it became something else. That evening, as music floated above from the ballroom, Eleanor led her sisters down the narrow stairway, their gowns swishing across the steps, jewels glittering in the flickering lamplight. Behind them walked 3 enslaved men, young and strong, chosen from the fields for their broad shoulders and tall frames. Their wrists were bound, their eyes hollow with dread, for they had been summoned before. They knew the cellar's purpose when the sisters came in their finery. The harvest feast had brought a dozen wealthy guests to the house, men and women in elegant dress, their laughter rising with the strains of violins. But beneath that celebration, Eleanor had arranged what she called the private entertainment. Not all guests were invited. Only a select few who shared her appetite, or who could be trusted to keep their silence, were led through a side door and down into the cellar. Among them was a merchant from New Orleans, a man whose fortune was tied to the sugar trade, and a visiting planter from Natchez. Their faces bore the look of men who had been promised something shocking, something forbidden. The cellar glowed with candlelight set into iron sconces. A small platform had been built from wooden crates, serving as a stage. The sisters arranged themselves in chairs as though at a playhouse, their dresses spread wide, their faces flushed with anticipation. Eleanor clapped her hands, and the 3 bound men were pushed onto the platform. Charlotte giggled as she produced a set of masks, grotesque things painted with exaggerated expressions of joy and sorrow. One by one she tied them to the men's faces, laughing as the painted grins hid their fear. "This," Eleanor announced to her guests, her voice ringing with a chilling theatricality, "is our harvest pageant. And like any performance, it must have drama, struggle, and a victor. The rules were simple, though cruel. The men would fight until one was left standing. No weapons, only fists and desperation. At first, the men refused, standing stiff as statues, refusing to turn on one another. Margaret's lips curved into a cold smile, and she whispered to her sister. A moment later, a whip was fetched from the overseer's quarters. Its crack split the air, and one of the men staggered under its lash. Another blow fell, and then another, until at last the men turned toward each other, driven less by rivalry than by the need to survive the moment. The struggle began awkwardly, half-heartedly, the men's fists striking more at the air than at flesh. But the sisters urged them on with shrieks of laughter, clapping their hands like children at a puppet show. The merchant leaned forward in his chair, eyes gleaming with fascination, while the planter chuckled uneasily, though his laughter carried a nervous edge. The cellar rang with the sounds of fists striking flesh, of bodies colliding, of muffled cries behind painted masks. Charlotte rose from her chair, clapping her hands in rhythm, and shouted for them to move faster. Margaret whispered encouragements in a voice as sweet as honey, her eyes glowing with hunger. Eleanor sat regal, her pale eyes unblinking, watching every blow with the focus of a queen at court. The violence intensified, and soon blood stained the men's shirts, drops falling onto the dirt floor. One man collapsed, gasping, while the other two staggered on, locked in a grim embrace. At last one struck the other hard enough that the weaker fell, his mask splitting as he hit the floor. Silence filled the cellar, broken only by the gasps of the defeated men. Eleanor rose, lifting her wineglass in triumph. "And there is our victor," she declared, as though crowning a champion at a tournament. The guests applauded, though not all with equal enthusiasm. The merchant clapped loudly, his face alight with cruel enjoyment. The planter's hands struck together only once or twice before falling to his lap, his gaze darting toward the door. But the performance was not over. Eleanor motioned for the surviving man to be brought forward. He stood trembling, his chest heaving, blood running down his cheek. She touched his face with a gloved hand, tilting his chin upward as though he were a prize animal on display. "Strength," she murmured. "Endurance. But let us see how long it lasts." With a snap of her fingers, a servant brought forward a brazier of hot coals, carried carefully on iron tongs. The sisters leaned forward eagerly as Eleanor pressed the iron near the man's arm, letting the heat sear close without touching. The man flinched, his body jerking against his restraints, and Charlotte burst into laughter. Margaret whispered, "Do it," her voice soft but sharp as a blade. The iron touched skin, and the man's scream echoed off the cellar walls, swallowed almost at once by the strains of music above. The cellar became a theater of cruelty, each moment another act in a grotesque performance. The sisters took turns devising torments, testing how much the body could endure while the soul remained trapped within it. Their guests, complicit by their silence, sipped wine and watched, some with fascination, others with discomfort they dared not voice. For to accuse the ladies of Belle was to invite scandal, perhaps ruin, and who among them would risk their standing for the sake of enslaved men's suffering? By the time the harvest feast ended and the guests departed into the humid night, the cellar was thick with the smell of blood and smoke. 2 of the men were carried back to the quarters, broken and near death. The third did not rise again. His body was disposed of quietly, buried in an unmarked grave by the swamp, where the earth swallowed secrets as eagerly as it did rainwater. Above, in the grand ballroom, Eleanor and her sisters rejoined the party, their gowns pristine, their smiles flawless, as though nothing had occurred beneath their feet. The whispers that followed the harvest feast were different from the rumors that had preceded it. Guests who had once laughed away the tales now avoided Belle entirely. Servants spoke in hushed tones of the cellar, of the cries that slipped into their dreams. Even neighboring planters, themselves no strangers to cruelty, muttered uneasily when Eleanor's name was mentioned. Something about the brazenness of her spectacle unsettled them. To punish enslaved people was expected, to revel in their agony, to turn it into a stage for amusement. That was a darkness even hardened men struggled to face. But Eleanor and her sisters did not stop. If anything, the harvest feast emboldened them. Over the months that followed, they devised new entertainments, each one crueler than the last. The cellar became their private theater, the stage for a nightmare that unfolded again and again beneath the house. And though many in the community suspected, few dared to intervene. The St. Clairs were powerful, wealthy, and untouchable. To challenge them was to risk ruin, so the whispers remained whispers, and the screams remained muffled by the earth. The true downfall of Belle came not from neighbors or the law, but from within. One winter evening, a fire broke out in the quarters, spreading quickly through the rows of wooden cabins. In the chaos, several enslaved men attempted escape, slipping into the swamps under cover of smoke. Among them was Josiah, a man who had survived more than one of the sisters' entertainments. His back bore scars from their games, his hands twisted by burns. But his memory remained sharp, and he carried with him not only the will to survive, but the knowledge of what had occurred in the cellar. Josiah reached freedom months later, traveling north by night, sheltered by strangers who guided him toward Ohio. When he finally spoke of what he had endured, his words painted a picture so horrifying that even abolitionists accustomed to tales of cruelty were stunned into silence. His testimony was written down, passed among networks of activists, printed in pamphlets that circulated in whispers. The story of the white ladies who tortured black men for entertainment spread, its details shifting but its essence remaining unchanged. Belle became less a place than a legend, a specter of evil wrapped in silk and lace. Colonel St. Clair died before the war, his name honored by those who never dared look beneath the surface of his household. Eleanor and her sisters lived to see the Confederacy fall, though by then their wealth had withered, their estate reduced to ashes and ruin. They fled into obscurity, their names largely erased from polite history. But among the descendants of those who had suffered at Belle, the story did not vanish. It lingered, carried like an heirloom of grief, whispered from one generation to the next. The tale of the mistresses who turned pain into play, who wore beauty like a mask while their hearts rotted with cruelty, and even now, when travelers pass the remnants of Belle, its cracked foundations half buried in the swamp, its oak tree still standing like a sentinel, they say the place is haunted. Not by the colonel, not by the soldiers who marched across Louisiana, but by the laughter of women, faint and mocking, rising from the cellar when the night is still. Time has a way of burying the truth beneath layers of silence. After the war ended, plantations across the South collapsed into ruin, their wealth stripped, their grandeur exposed as fragile glass. Belle was no different. The sugarcane fields, once the pride of the St. Clairs, lay untended, the soil exhausted. The house itself remained standing, but its paint peeled, its shutters sagged, and vines crept up the columns as if nature itself wished to reclaim it. Eleanor and her sisters, stripped of their fortune and their slaves, lived in shadows of their former selves. Yet their reputation clung to them like a curse. Neighbors avoided them. Former guests whispered about the nights they had seen too much. The community, unwilling to confront the truth openly, punished the women with silence. Invitations ceased. Doors remained closed. Children were warned not to wander near Belle after dusk. The sisters, once the center of social gatherings, now moved like ghosts among the living, their beauty fading, their laughter hollow. Eleanor, it is said, grew bitter and reclusive. She was seen pacing the veranda at night, muttering to herself, her pale eyes searching the dark fields as though she expected someone to rise from them. Charlotte's once playful laugh became shrill, echoing across the empty halls until even servants fled her presence. Margaret alone retained her quiet demeanor, but she carried a sadness that weighed on her like a stone. Some whispered she heard voices at night, men crying from beneath the floorboards, begging for release. The decline of the sisters did not erase the memory of their cruelty. Enslaved people who had once survived their torments told stories to their children, and those children told them again, until the legend of the White Ladies of Belle became part of the oral fabric of Louisiana's haunted past. Josiah's testimony, preserved by abolitionists, reached even further, embedding itself in northern newspapers that spoke of the South's inhumanity. Though names were sometimes changed and details blurred, the essence remained, that there had been women who delighted in pain, who used their power not only to oppress, but to entertain themselves with the suffering of men. By the late 1800s, Belle stood nearly abandoned. Only a few laborers remained on the grounds tending scraps of land for meager pay. Travelers passing along the bayou began to speak of strange lights flickering in the old house at night. Some claimed they heard the faint notes of a piano drifting from broken windows, though the keys had long been shattered. Others swore they saw 3 women standing beneath the oak tree, their gowns luminous in the moonlight, their faces pale as bone. Skeptics dismissed it as imagination, the mind inventing phantoms where history had already written horrors. But those who ventured too near often returned shaken, their faces pale, their voices lowered when they spoke of what they had felt in the air around the ruins. One tale from 1892 told of a group of young men who dared each other to enter the abandoned house at midnight. They carried lanterns and whiskey, laughing as they pushed open the rotting door. The parlor was silent, the walls streaked with mildew, the floorboards sagging. Yet when they descended into the cellar, their laughter died. The air grew cold, unnaturally so, their lantern flames sputtering. And then they heard it. The sound of laughter, faint and feminine, echoing from the corners though no one else was there. Terrified, they fled into the night, swearing they had seen the outline of masked figures watching them from the shadows. 2 of the young men never returned to Belle, insisting the place was cursed. The third, emboldened by pride, went back weeks later and was found unconscious at the foot of the cellar stairs, his face twisted in terror, his hair streaked white though he was only 20. Stories like these transformed the tale of Eleanor and her sisters from whispered history into folklore. They became known as the White Ladies of Belle, spirits who haunted the bayou not with sorrow, as most ghosts do, but with malice. They were said to lure wanderers into the ruins, their laughter sweet as honey, their beauty still preserved in spectral form. And once inside, the wanderers would vanish, never to return. Whether these legends were inventions or the product of guilty imaginations hardly mattered. The effect was the same. The plantation became a place of dread, its very soil a reminder of the horrors buried there. As the 20th century dawned, Belle collapsed into near ruin. Hurricanes tore through its roof, floods swallowed its lower floors, and the swamp crept ever closer. By the 1920s, only fragments of its columns remained, the oak tree still standing sentinel, its roots tangled with bones long forgotten. Yet the legend endured, told by locals around campfires, printed in ghost story collections, whispered to tourists eager for a taste of southern Gothic. Some stories softened the edges, painting the sisters as tragic figures driven mad by war and loss. Others embellished, claiming the women had struck deals with the devil, trading their souls for eternal beauty and endless entertainment. But at the heart of it all remained the same, unshakable truth, that there had been a time and place where women of privilege turned suffering into sport. To speak of it now is to walk a narrow line between history and myth. Scholars debate whether Josiah's testimony was exaggerated, whether the tales that spread through abolitionist networks were propaganda designed to inflame northern outrage. Skeptics point out the lack of concrete evidence, no court records, no official charges, only fragments of memory and rumor. Yet those fragments persist with a consistency that suggests more than invention. Pain leaves its mark not only on the flesh, but on the landscape, on the collective memory of those who endured it. And Belle, whatever its exact truths, has remained stained in a way no amount of doubt can erase. What makes the story so disturbing is not only the cruelty itself, but the faces behind it. Society has long imagined slaveholders as men, overseers with whips, masters counting profits. But here the monsters wore silk gowns and lace gloves. They smiled from porches, poured tea for guests, played piano in the evenings. They embodied refinement, femininity, the very ideals the South exalted in its women. And yet behind closed doors they orchestrated horrors that defied imagination. The contrast makes the cruelty sharper, more grotesque. To know that laughter, elegance and gentility could coexist with such depravity is to glimpse the darkest corners of human nature. Today, when visitors stand at the site where Belle once stood, little remains but earth and memory. The oak tree still spreads its massive limbs, its roots gnarled like the fingers of the dead. Some say if you stand beneath it at midnight, you can hear whispers carried on the wind, pleas for mercy, cries of agony, or the soft mocking laughter of women who believed themselves untouchable. Others say the ground itself feels heavy, as though the soil remembers, as though every blade of grass grows from blood that once soaked the earth. And perhaps that is the true haunting of Belle. Not the apparitions, not the flickering lights or the echoes of laughter, but the knowledge that such things truly happened, that human beings given unchecked power and indulgence could descend into a theater of cruelty so profound it left scars on the land itself. Whether or not the ghosts remain, the story does, and it is more chilling than any phantom. When we tell these tales, it is tempting to frame them as warnings about monsters, to imagine Eleanor and her sisters as aberrations, unique in their depravity. But the deeper horror lies in the possibility that they were not unique at all, that others like them existed, their stories lost to silence, their victims' cries swallowed by time. Belle is remembered not because it was the only place of such cruelty, but because fragments of its truth managed to survive. How many other cellars, how many other nights of laughter and screams went unrecorded? In the end, the story of the White Ladies is not merely a ghost story. It is a mirror held to the past, a reminder of the darkness that can flourish behind the masks of civility. It is a testament to the endurance of memory, even when official history tries to bury it. And it is a warning whispered through generations that cruelty thrives where power goes unchecked, where empathy is smothered by indulgence. The ruins of Belle may continue to sink into the bayou, its columns swallowed by vines, its cellar flooded by muddy water. The sisters themselves are long dead, their bones mouldering in forgotten graves. But the legend endures. When the night is still, when the moon rises over the Louisiana swamps, some say you can still hear the faint strains of music from a long-extinguished piano, and over it the high, cold laughter of three women who once turned pain into play. Laughter that does not fade, laughter that reminds us that some ghosts are not bound to places but to deeds so monstrous they echo forever. And that is the story of the white ladies who tortured black men for entertainment. The most disturbing plantation tale whispered from the dark heart of the South. A story not meant to entertain, but to unsettle, to remind and to haunt, long after the telling ends.